sometimes you're just like, what is up with the cosmic turtle, Steven? Just saying. Hello everyone, it is Jazz here, and finally I'm getting around to offering you guys another round of 5 book reviews. I'm super behind, I apologize. It's just that 5 book reviews or any book review video that I've ever done, they just take forever for me to film and edit. I will, as usual, tell you what books I'm planning to be reviewing today, and I have of course left the timestamps below so that if you do want to watch this entire video and find out about all 5 of these books, you can. But also, if there's just a book that just sounds more interesting to you than any of the others, you can click that timestamp. Today I will be reviewing The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins, It and Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, Firebird by Mercedes Lackey, and the Annotated Anne of Green Gables by Montgomery. Even though Firebird, Songbirds and Snakes, and Dr. Sleep were in some sort of reading vlog at some point during the last few months on this channel, I still wanted to do a official 5 book reviews with them included, just in case you're not a reading vlog person or I had like some new thoughts to offer on them after my initial review of them. So that's what's going on there, and let's jump into the book reviews. I'm gonna go ahead and start with the book that I might have the most thoughts on, and that is of course The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. This is the prequel to the Hunger Games series. It follows an 18-year-old Coriolanus Snow, who will of course eventually become President Snow. Snow and his schoolmates who are enlisted to mentor the tributes from the districts in the 10th Hunger Games that is going on. And because the Hunger Games are in their early years, if you will, things do not quite go to plan, and thus Coriolanus's social climbing goals are threatened. I really loved the social and political ideas explored in this, but there were also several striking things that are just parts of fiction that I think could have been done better. You really get to see how the initial war that caused the Hunger Games to come to be with the districts fighting the capital, how that affected the people in the capital, which was really interesting to see. It basically shows that war doesn't really benefit anyone. It scars everyone, and it might turn someone into a more negative figure, as it does for Snow. It explores political control in general, how the games are both a sort of mind bending technique for both the capital people as well as the people in the districts. It's not just kind of manipulating the people in the districts. It was also really interesting to see the historical world building that is going on. You get to see why certain things are the way they are during the Hunger Games books proper, and also you get to see just little bits of history that are involved in the Hunger Games in general, such as the backstory of the Hanging Tree song, etc., etc. I honestly would have been entirely happy if this book was entirely just social, political, and historical background ideas. It sounds like it would be boring, but that was the stuff that I was most interested in. What I struggled with this book was characters and plot, which in fiction are pretty big things. My main issue with this was the character development as a whole. Now, I'm not somebody that thinks characters have to do likable things or be likable people for them to be interesting. And I think the important thing for this book, because we're of course following a character that will be eventually considered a villain, is that we make him really, really interesting and compelling. And there's a little bit of that in this book with Coriolanus Snow, but I definitely think it could have been taken further. The District 12 tribute that he's mentoring, Lucy Gray, had a lot of interesting history in terms of her culture, but her character herself, I couldn't tell you a single thing that she liked or a single thing that made her that particularly interesting. Some of the friendships, or if you could call them friendships, that Coriolanus has going on are not particularly believable or interesting. And there's a lot of characters in this book as well. Of course, you have the tributes from all the districts. You have all the classmates of Coriolanus Snow that are mentoring them. You have a lot of adult characters, and that's a lot of characters to just feel meh about pretty much 99% of them. So what happens is that I felt like the book started to lose a little bit of believability, and I just didn't buy a lot of the friendships, romantic relationships, a lot of the happenings that were going on. And the games themselves in this were so not interesting to me. I was pretty much more interested in anything but the actual Hunger Games. Now, some of the stuff that was going on outside of that was sort of the political manipulation sort of stuff, that part was a little bit more interesting. But yeah, I think that several pages of this long book could have been cut just by cutting some of the stuff from the games, especially since the tribute in there that you were interested in wasn't really doing much. I did listen to this in audiobook, and I actually would recommend maybe checking out the audiobook if you are going to check out this book. I do think there are certain elements of it that are they just move a little faster for me in terms of the story. Only gripe that I would say that I have maybe with the audiobook is that there is a lot of song going on in this book. Not just the Hanging Tree song, but the character Lucy Gray is involved with a group that does perform quite a bit, and the reader could have read the songs a little bit more poetically. I don't expect them to sing them. That's not really the jive for every book. That doesn't really work for every audiobook. But I do think he could have read it not just like he reads prose. I give this book 3.5 stars. I think you can take this book or leave it. You don't have to read it to read The Hunger Games, obviously, because it's a prequel. But if you do want the history, backstory stuff, that is the reason to read this book. If you want, like, a really exciting plot, I personally didn't find the plot that exciting or believable at points. So there's that. Next up, we have It. So It is set in a small town called Derry, Maine. Derry, Maine has been basically overtaken every 27 years by a otherworldly entity, which is entitled It. And it feeds on the children of Derry, Maine. It also brings out the worst in the adults in the town, and basically the town becomes a city of anarchy, if you will. This book jumps back and forth through time as it follows 7 characters who in their childhood fought the entity that is It, and 27 years later in their adulthood, they come back to fight and hopefully defeat it again. It was a reread for me. I had read it as a teenager, but I didn't really remember any of it. And as the newer film adaptations started coming out, I wanted to be able to compare things and contrast things and see what they did differently and what they didn't. And so I decided to give the book another reread and see what I thought of it. Now, I will say that I think I did like it better the first time I read it. When I was a teenager, I hadn't read quite as many Stephen King books as I had now, and once you've read a lot of one author or more of one author, you can't help but compare the books. And so thus it kind of became not my favorite of the Stephen King books that I've read, even though I do still think it has merit and it's a good book. Now, my main issue with it in terms of just like vague nitpicky problems is the length of the story. I don't feel like it needs the length that it is. It's not like The Stand, which is a brilliant book, by the way. I highly recommend. But The Stand earns every single one of those over 1,000 pages. Everything in that is important, and nothing in there I thought was wasted. However, with it, I do think it could have been edited down considerably, and I'm not just talking about the scene that everyone has a problem with, which we won't talk too much about in this review, but I also have a problem with it as well. There's just no reason for it. It's weird. It's also kind of pointless. I'm just saying, I'm sorry. It doesn't need to be there. But other than even that scene, I will say that a lot of the character studies are not necessarily things about the main characters. So those, while interesting and really investing still, could have been considerably shortened. I do think a lot of the sections that are about the history of Derry, Maine, while important to kind of show how the entity of it brings out the worst in people, they also could have been shortened considerably. So I definitely think this could have been maybe an 800-page book, maybe less, and still been equally as interesting. While I like a weird book, I like a lot of crazy weirdness, I like my weirdness a little more structured than it is to a certain extent. It's structured enough that I can not be annoyed by it, but I definitely could have done with a little bit more structured weirdness, if that makes any sense, and maybe not so much ballistic weirdness. And this has a little bit of that going on in this. However, I would say, of course, the character development, because Stephen King's strength is character development. He writes the best characters, kind of overrides a lot of my issues that I had during the reread with this, because the characters, at least the main characters, are really investing. They're really excellently put together. You definitely care about what's going on and what's going to happen to them, and you get all the feels. Some stuff that happens to them I don't necessarily want to happen to them, but I'm still willing to go on the journey. So I do love that part. I do like that it explores this idea of an evil entity and what it can do inside of people and the actions it can make people do, and the idea of fears and how it feeds on the fears of children. I think it's a really interesting study on those topics. This book deals with a lot of sensitive topics, particularly for a era like now that's going on. So it does deal with racism, abuse, anti-Semitism, anything you can think of that's like a deep, possibly triggering topic. It deals with. And it deals with it in a very in-your-face, no things held back sort of way. I think it's done in a way that is to show that this entity does bring out negativity in people, and it's ugly, and it shows how ugly it is and why those things shouldn't exist. So if you can read it like that, it makes sense. I'm able to view it in that way, as seeing it as historical reference, because some of this book is set in the 60s and stuff like that did happen, and also showing that even by the 80s, when the book comes into that moment, that not much has changed. And I think if you can think of it in an idea sort of way, then you'll probably be okay. But if that is something that is all triggering to you, or you think will upset you because there's quite a lot of slurs and whatnot in it, maybe take a pass on this book. This is another one that I listened to an audiobook. I would recommend, if you want to finish this book quickly, checking out the audiobook. It does move things along faster. The reader of the audiobook is excellent, really does great voices. His Pennywise is quite bomb and quite creepifying. So if you want to give the audiobook a roll, I would definitely recommend that. Even though it sounds like I had a ton of issues with this book, I do still think there's a lot of interesting things about the characters and the ideas of it that have merit. I still gave this a 4.5 star rating. So it's not a 5 star, but I definitely like it better than any of the ones that I've given 4 stars, mostly because the characters are so well done, and they're probably some of my favorite characters in like the Stephen King universe. We get to chat about Dr. Sleep. This is the sequel to Stephen King's book The Shining. I actually reread The Shining, and it's included in one of these 5 book reviews videos, so I will try to link you to that if you want to know my thoughts on my reread of The Shining. But this one I read for the very first time. This book follows the adult Dan Torrance as he journeys through a lot of his mental and physical and emotional scars that he has from being a child in the Overlook, still having the psychic ability, which is The Shining, and his own struggles with addiction. As he's journeying through all of that, he ends up meeting a 12-year-old girl named Abra, who also has The Shining. Abra's life is in jeopardy as there is a nomadic tribe of, I guess what you would call psychic vampires called the True Knot that feed on children that have The Shining. And so Dan and Abra and a couple of other people have to band together to fight this little group of evil. I freaking love this book. My favorite thing about this book is that it is very much the opposite of what The Shining is trying to do in terms of theme and really exploring the ideas in a different way, and I really appreciate that. I think while I guess The Shining has a very finished ending, maybe it doesn't need a sequel. I do like that it has a sequel so that you can see that element of the story. For example, I feel like The Shining explores the destruction of innocence, and I feel like this book is about preserving that. The Shining is about addiction, and this book is about recovery. There's lots of mere other side of the coin situations that are going on in this story. It adds a little something to my endearment to the protagonists in this book and how they really are banding together to kind of fight for this really great cause, which is preserving the childhood of this child. And how also through that Dan can kind of resolve some of his own childhood issues, and that is just so beautiful. I actually quite liked the villains in this book, The True Knot. I know that they're not necessarily for everyone, but I really think the world building for them is very interesting. I really like how Stephen King actually shows how their ability works instead of just telling you things. And I think those are some really striking scenes. I also like that they really suit the concept of the book as Dan is dealing with addiction, and they're dealing with addiction in their own way by feeding on children, basically. So they are so kind of wrapped up in this that it makes them become a monster, and how that's a really interesting concept of what addiction can do to a person. This book for me too was an incredibly fast read. I was extremely invested in what was going on. I think it's the equal amount for me personally of a character-driven and plot-driven story. And I feel like because this is, I guess, what you would consider new Stephen King, there is a little bit more of a quick progression in this book than The Shining. Although The Shining kind of needs that slow progression, it's still a 5-star book, y'all. So it's just like this book needs something different than that book needs. And I think that is also a really nice contrast to The Shining in that way. I do too like that this book is its own story. It's not trying to overly carry on things from The Shining, and I kind of like when duologies do that, because you aren't rehashing anything. And I really appreciate the lack of a rehash, if you will. I think it's needless to say that I gave this book 5 stars. Also, let me know if you want me to do a review of the film of Dr. Sleep, because I have a lot of thoughts that there's just too many to talk about in this video about that movie. And if you want those thoughts, just put that in the comments, and I will make a separate video of my thoughts on the Dr. Sleep movie. Let's talk about Firebird. So this is a fairy tale retelling based around the Russian folktale by the same title, The Firebird. This follows a young prince named Elliot. He is sort of the persecuted son amongst his brothers in his family, and he basically is having a lot of interactions with this mysterious creature called the Firebird, who is stealing cherries from his father, the king's favorite cherry tree. And an adventure happens. This is the first book in a duology. I actually read the books out of order. I read The Black Swan before I read this. So just know you can read them as standalones if you want, but both of them are based on folktales, which later became ballets. So if that sounds vaguely interesting to you, you might want to give them a roll. I did really enjoy Firebird. I do think that it's a very plot-driven story. And it is also a story that doesn't have a ton of characterization. However, even though those things don't usually float my boat, it kind of works for this one solely because a lot of the fairy tale or folk tale original tales are very much written like that. They are more about expressing the lesson of the piece or expressing just the overall story in general than the traditional way of telling a modern story where you have character-driven choices. It works very much for this book because it is going for a fairy tale telling style. Mercedes Lackey books from the 2 books of hers that I've read are very exposition oriented in general. There's not a ton of dialogue, but when there is dialogue, it is quite fun and interesting. And I do really like what this book does with the world building in terms of the Firebird especially. I think that it's actually a little bit more interesting than any rendition that I've seen in terms of this fairy tale that I know of. I did really like following the main character and seeing his adventure play out. I will say that the princes in both of the books of Mercedes Lackey's that I've read are very womanizing types, but I guess since it's set back in the day, if you will, and they are wealthy men, I think it'd be kind of hard not to make them that way. I will say Ilya, though, is a little quicker developed out of that moment than the prince in Black Swan, so there's that moment. He's not a total jerk. The only thing that I would say, though, is that I feel like Ilya gets knocked out a lot during this book, and it's kind of odd how often it happens. So just know that going in is that the main character gets knocked on the head 50 bajillion times, but it kind of works because he's the persecuted brother, but it's also kind of odd. In terms of the audiobook, I do recommend the audiobook for the most part, but you're going to want to speed the audiobook up because the reader is a bit of a slower reader. So just know that going in, speed that audiobook up, but it's still an interesting listen and a fairly interesting read, especially if you like fairy tale retellings. I gave this one 4 stars. Lastly, I have the Annotated Anne of Green Gables. If you don't know what Anne of Green Gables is about, it is a classic novel which follows a young girl named Anne who is an orphan, and she accidentally gets adopted by a brother and sister, Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert, and things kind of roll on from there as Anne makes her various life mistakes and overcomes them. If you've followed this channel for a long time or any time at all, you know that this book is my fandom. I think you obviously know, since I've reread this book many times, that this book is a 5-star book for me in general. I'll probably try to focus more on what I thought of the actual annotated edition in this review because you guys know I love the characters in Anne. I also think this book makes me happy. I love that it's about overcoming obstacles. I love that it's about a found family situation. I think the characters are really well developed and interesting. It's a very anecdotal plot, but I like a good classic book with some anecdotal plotness, so it wins in that regard. And the rest of the series is indeed solid. So in terms of the annotated edition, I found it really particularly interesting. I loved reading the stuff about Ellen Montgomery, the author, and finding out new things about her. I also think it's really interesting that this dives into a lot of the backstory on different parts of landscape. This writing is very much about the setting and exploring the flowers and different things of the earth there in terms of the location. And so I think it's really wonderful how it's written into this, the meanings of those things and how they play into the plot and the characters. I also think it's really interesting in terms of the annotations about the literature referenced in this book. You really start to see how much literature affects Anne's character in particular as a whole, how she often quotes it, and how much reading and things like that are very much part of her identity and part of what makes Anne Anne. This annotated edition also includes a lot of the recited poetry and other things that are referenced in here, and it's interesting to see how those things are infiltrated in other characters' stories and how they inform the feelings of characters. If you're looking to delve into historical background on certain things in this book, or you want to read the recipes even that are foods that are made in this, that is included in here. And also there were some words that I didn't know were unfamiliar words in this book that I learned what they meant, and I thought that was really cool as well. I will say that it doesn't have any color illustrations or photos of film adaptations or anything like that, which is usually what's included in a lot of annotated editions that I already own. But it does have black and white illustrations as well as historical photographs, which are obviously in black and white because they didn't have color photos. So you're still getting a little bit of visual interest. As with all annotated editions, obviously, if you've never read the book, you might get a little spoiled on some things because they do tend to talk about in certain things the concepts and themes illustrated by the book, and they tend to have spoilers in there. So maybe read the book first without the annotations and then go back and read the annotations later if you don't want any late spoilers. But if you don't care about that, just go ahead and get the annotated edition. As I said already, 5-star book, just in general. Read just some Anna Green Gables. Even if you're not thinking that you're an Anna Green Gables person, just give it a roll. Those were my 5 book reviews. I feel like I talked a heck of a ton, but that's, I guess, what you're here for. And let me know in the comments what you thought of any of these books, if you have read them, or if you're interested in reading any of these books. Comments really do help out this channel, so just drop me a comment and say hi if you want to. And that is it for today, my fabulous peeps. I will see you all soon. Bye!